We're going to talk about school safety, specifically about the importance of making sure that we have plans in place and that we practice those plans and that we do other things that directly impact our students. So at Region 13, we've adopted to look at this from a three-prong approach standpoint. Specifically, anytime there is some kind of major school attack, the immediate response in the news is that we need to put more security measures in place. But what we know, 19 years post-Columbine, is that in spite of putting lots of security measures in place, we still end up with kids doing some pretty horrific things on school grounds. So we have processed this from the standpoint of how do you look at this as a multi-pronged approach to addressing school safety needs. Security is, of course, part of it. Also looking at the mental health needs of our kids as well as the adults in our building. And then looking at culture and climate issues. So we're going to start with talking about security and security things that are already available to folks as well as security measures that we need to take into account. So some of the things that we want you to consider is your building secure? Do people have access to your building, and can people get in your building without you knowing about it throughout the day? The answer to that, and we'll talk a little bit more with school safety audits in a second, the answer to that question is overwhelmingly yes. People have access to your building without other adults knowing. When people do have access to your building, how do the adults in the building respond to it? And we'll talk a little bit about that. Do students open exit doors when someone knocks? The answer is yes. Almost 100% of the time. As an adult, if I knock on a door because the door is locked, kids will open the door for me. Looking at things like, do all visitors have to enter the building through a secured entryway, go through the office, make sure that they're getting identified? Do you have an emergency operation plan in place, and do people know what it is, and do they follow it? Do they have access to that information? And from a risk assessment standpoint, do you know the kids most at risk in your community as well as the adults most at risk in your community that have the potential to do harmful things to your building? Okay. And all of you immediately had someone that came to mind when I said that, right? So proactively, what are we doing to address that? So some of the things that we need to think about is what's currently in place from a school safety standpoint. Chapter 37 requires that we have an emergency operation plan. The state requires that we have an emergency operation plan, but not all districts in Region 13 have emergency operation plans. So one of the things that we need to work on is to make sure that we have that in place. And we take into account as part of that plan, what are the risks we have identified in our communities, both from a human resource risk standpoint, like people problem, as well as other risk factors. Do we have a chemical plant in our community that is generating potential toxins that could be released, and what are we going to do if we need to evacuate our kids? So that is part of it. We also have to look at campus safety audits, which is a requirement that every 3 years, each campus in your district have a thorough audit where people come in, or you can do it internally, and they assess risk factors, and they assess the vulnerability of your campus. One of the components of that is having an intruder alert drill, and we'll talk about that piece in a second. And then student code of conduct. Now, all districts have student code of conducts that define why kids are removed, why kids are suspended, why they're expelled. But the other thing that we need to make sure that we're addressing is making sure we have positive behavior supports in place that address culture and climate issues. And that's where I think we are a little bit on the light side. Other Chapter 37 requirements, and this has been a hot topic as of late, is Chapter 37 allows school districts to place school marshals, which can be carrying concealed weapons. You can have one school marshal for every 200 kids in your building, and that applies to charter schools, it applies to public schools, it applies to private schools. And those school marshals, their identity needs to be kept secret. and they should not be directly working with kids. But if they work with kids, then their weapon has to be in a locked, secured box that's within arm's reach of them at all times. And that's the current law that's in place. Now, my guess is each legislative session we get further clarification on school marshals, and there is a big push for people looking at how do you arm teachers in the state of Texas. We do have some districts in this region that currently are moving down that path. So we're not sure quite what that's going to look like over the next couple of years. But this is an option. There's some security action steps that we want you to think about. First, make sure you're protecting your entrance and exits. That's an easy one, guys. Making sure that your building is secured. Making sure that we have doors locked. Making sure we have a dedicated entryway and we know who's in our building at any given time. It's much easier to keep people out than to deal with them once they're inside the building. So we need to remember that. We do campus safety audits for districts, and in the 29 campus safety audits we have done, we've been able to get in 29 buildings undetected. So we have a 100% success rate in breaking into schools. And we're not even subtle about it, guys. Areas that you need to focus on is I can get into any cafeteria at any given time through the loading dock. And the cafeteria staff will never stop you. We had one staff member say he was a substitute teacher and walked right through the office into the building, and the front office staff said nothing. So some of this is making sure that we train front office staff. The other area that's incredibly vulnerable, guys, is your portable buildings. And unfortunately, we still have a lot of portable buildings on our campus, and some of our more at-risk students are being housed in those portable buildings, correct? So we keep those doors unlocked. They're not in a secure environment. People can just walk up to the building. So we need to remember all of those things. We need to make sure that we're practicing an emergency operation plan on a regular basis, which includes looking at lockdowns, shelters in place, reunification off-site. Best practice says that we should be doing one off-site evacuation minimally every year, which means the whole school is evacuated and moved to a different location. And you practice that. It's especially important for the kids that we work with. A couple of years ago, I was on a campus in a life skills class, and the fire alarm went off, and all the kids had a huge difficulty with the fire alarm, to the point that kids were becoming aggressive, kids were having, and I said, this happens every time. So if we are not doing enough to work with our kids to help practice for what to do in an emergency, then we're putting our kids at risk. And we're putting the adults that support those kids at risk as well. So we really need to make sure that we're including our kids in these drills and we're getting all partners involved. We also need to make sure that we're teaching our kids not to open doors. We're teaching our kids that not all adults that knock on the door are there to be friendly. We need to make sure that we are looking at those soft points of access on your campus. Playgrounds. Playgrounds are a really easy target. We need to make sure that we are doing a more diligent job about getting our staff comfortable asking strangers, can I help you? When they see somebody they don't know. Our intruder drills, we need to practice them. Easy ways to practice intruder drills are, do not give a parent, when they come to the cafeteria, come to the lunch with their student, don't give them a badge. And ask them to keep track of how many adults, ask them who they are, and send them back to the office to get the badge. Now, I know a lot of us are in smaller communities, so we know everybody. But every time we violate our policies by not following through with procedures that we've established, we're really putting people at risk. So from a security standpoint, we have a lot of tools. We just need to be much more diligent about making sure we're using the tools that we have. Next area I want to talk about is mental health. And from a mental health standpoint, This is the area where I think of all the things that we could beef up our supports in, this is probably the area that we could do a much better job. So some quick reference guides about school shooters, and I find some of this information pretty fascinating. About 25% are motivated by a desire for attention or recognition. 75% of all school shooters felt bullied. And then we have a range of motivations between those two. 27% of attackers interested in violent movies. Not a big surprise there. But if you look at the bottom, 93% of attackers engaged in some behavior prior to the attack that caused others to be concerned. These are not people that we are not worried about. We're worried about the people that are doing this. They're already on our radar. So if they're on our radar and we're not intervening, at some point in time, we have to own that, right? 95% or 93% of attackers planned out the attack in advance. So it's not just one day they wake up and decide, hey, I'm going to do this. The other part of this is they plan the attack out and they let people know about it. And then finally, 95% of attackers were current students. So these are not strangers that are hanging out at schools, waiting to do something bad. These are people that are connected to that building in some way. So when we go back and we talk about your risk assessments and those people in your communities that you're concerned about, your students in your communities that you're concerned about, we don't need to be afraid to have those kinds of conversations. We need to be willing to have the kind of conversation that, this student really has me concerned. And I know because of the student's history, they have access to opportunities to do bad things on campus. We need to be aware of that, and we need to be diligent about how we address that. So these are some statistics from the Texas School Safety Center from bullying standpoint. About 1 in 5 kids are being bullied on campus, and this is last year's information. About 1 in 6 kids are getting cyberbullied, which continues to be a large growing problem. Children with disabilities are 2 to 3 times more likely to be bullied than their non-disabled peers. Does anyone find that surprising? So I see lots of heads shaking no. So what are we specifically doing to support our students in addressing, navigating the challenges that they're facing in these environments? And males and females are equally likely to bully online, where historically, males tend to be much more likely to bully. Now that we've moved into cyberbullying as a major arena for acting out, girls have become equal opportunity employers in the bullying realm. Kids that experience trauma are at a much higher risk of being exposed to some of these things. Much higher risk for having mental health issues that may lead to impulsive problems. These are some current stats on mental health issues. 20% of all students 13 to 18 have a diagnosed mental health issue. We have lots of kids out there that are really struggling that may not necessarily be our kids. So what are we doing to increase the awareness of the kids that are struggling on a day-to-day basis? 11% mood disorder, 10% have a behavior or conduct disorder, and 8% have some kind of anxiety disorder. These are the stats I really want to hit home, though, because we've talked about kids, but do you have adults that you currently work with, or adults who have spouses that you currently work with that are struggling with mental health issues? 1 in 5 American adults has a mental health issue. Mental illness is the leading cause of disability worldwide. 1 in 10 full-time employees has an addiction problem. So next time you're in your district faculty meeting, you can go around the room and go, But think about it. 40% of employees with mental illness take time off because of it. So if you have people with excessive absenteeism, you have to start thinking, okay, what may be some of the cause of that? 35% or more of managers feel they have no formal training in dealing with the supports that they need to have in order to support employees. So as y'all are supervising people, and because of the background you come to the table with, y'all may feel much more comfortable dealing with mental health issues. But you have campuses on your you have principals on your campuses that this becomes very concerning for. And HR managers know the toll mental illness can take on the company, yet only 15% of all HR managers feel that they're comfortable in dealing with the complex mental health needs of staff. But 1 in 5 staff are showing up struggling. So if we look at who's at risk for causing challenges on our campuses, we really need to remember that these folks all are areas of concern. This next slide is the slide that was the most problematic and bothersome to me for a lot of different reasons. So kids in foster care. And when you look at the stats for kids in foster care, it's pretty grim. So if there's one area that I think we could all get better at finding ways to support, this is the area I think that we can make the biggest difference. So girls in foster care pregnant by 19, 50% of all girls who have been in the foster care system are pregnant by the time they're 19 years old. Of the adults who are in prison, 74% of them were in the foster care system at one point in time. Incarcerated within 2 years of aging out, 50% former foster youth on death row. Of people on death row, 80% of the people on death row were in foster care. We are greatly underserving this population of kids. And we need to be much more proactive about how we deal with those students. And a lot of those students are also students that we serve in our districts. So if we know this is the outcomes and this is what they're dealing with, then we have to do a much better job of meeting their complex needs. So what we immediately need to think about is, one, how do we increase awareness for the staff that work with all of our students about mental health issues, and how do we do a better job identifying our students who are struggling, maybe due to mental health issues, and who's responsible for helping them in the process. And I'm not advocating that this is just SPED's responsibility for dealing with this, but I think we play a role in it. And if nothing else, we can play a role in making sure that all staff in our building have a greater awareness of what mental health needs our kids have and the long-term impact that they can have as a result of that. Really good training we provide. Also, you can get this from Bluebonnet Trails, Mental Health First Aid, which is a great resource for your staff. It's an 8-hour class. Right now, there's currently a grant, and that grant allows for the books to be given free. And the books typically cost $20 a person. The challenge is it's limited to 30 people at a time to go through the training, but it's a great awareness. We can think about doing a potential trainer of trainers to get more people out there trained. As part of this, it's a very expensive training though. It's about $2,000 a person to get someone trained to be a trainer for mental health first aid. But if it's enough people had interest and we could do that, then we would certainly consider meeting that need for you guys. The last thing I want to talk about is culture and climate. From a culture and climate standpoint, we really need to remember 4 very succinct categories. 1, people can't feel connected if they don't feel safe. So we still have a lot of our kids that are showing up to school every day not feeling safe. If I come to school and I think that you're going to pick on me or you're going to harass me, and I'm not talking just the kids, the adults also, then that's a problem. Cool connections, a sense of belonging. We need to make sure that we are making kids feel like this is a place we want them to show up every day. Knowledge and fairness of rules and norms, How do we make sure that the rules are transparent and kids know what it is that they're supposed to do? And then looking at climate to support academic learning. What is our primary focus? And how do we increase the likelihood that kids are going to be able to experience positive academic growth? We do lots of culture and climate surveys with adults. I'm asking you to consider expanding that and do culture and climate surveys with your kids and with your parents in the community. Because our perception as a teacher on that campus may be dramatically different than the perception that our kids have, as well as the perception of the parents in the community. So if we're really going to address culture and climate, we need to take a much more broader, comprehensive view of what that would look like. This is not a you must do MTSS sell point, but what I will tell you is it's becoming increasingly more clear that campuses that do comprehensive multi-tiered systems of support from the RTI, positive behavior interventions and support, social emotional learning, now restorative discipline, also adding in trauma-informed practices, all of these things have a huge impact in the ability of kids to navigate complex school systems and to feel more connected. This is our model, so now you have a copy of it as far as how we tier all of this stuff in. But this is not something that just Region 13 does. Angela and I just got back from a conference where we presented on restorative parenting, and this is what people across the country are doing now. So when you start thinking about how do you embed all of these practices, it really is not a just do one thing and suddenly you've solved all your problems. You really do have to look at this as a multi-tiered process that supports ongoing student engagement.